On the 10th of September 2020, behind a tightly secured barrier, experts watched nervously as metal crates were brought in. The metal latches clattered open, and Lenny and Lisa stepped out. For the first time in 3,000 years, wild Tasmanian devils had set foot on mainland Australia. They stood still for a long moment, taking in the air of the wild. Actor Chris Hemsworth and his wife continued helping release the remaining animals. They hesitated for a few seconds, then quickly dashed into the bushes and disappeared. Watching from behind, Tim Faulkner, president of Aussie Ark, confidently declared, "In 100 years, we will witness them complete their mission of restoring the ecology of an entire country." But they did not have to wait nearly that long. Where Tasmanian devils established their territory, invasive species disappeared completely. Then, 6 months later, something strange appeared. A hidden camera mounted on a chestnut tree captured a scene the experts could not explain. Why was that creature here? And how could a conservation project involving Tasmanian devils end up solving three of Australia's most difficult ecological problems? When Australia was still largely untouched wilderness, Tasmanian devils were common carnivores across the continent, from the deserts of central Australia and the tropical forests of the north to the temperate regions of the south. For millions of years, they served as top scavengers and mid-sized predators across most of the continent's major ecosystems. But their later disappearance remained a mystery that scientists debated for years. It was not until a 2018 study that researchers concluded they had vanished from mainland Australia around 3,200 years ago, because of dingoes, which were roughly 3 times larger, hunted in packs, and had a clear advantage over the mostly solitary Tasmanian devils. Over time, Tasmanian devils disappeared from the mainland. Fortunately, dingoes never crossed the sea to Tasmania, making the island the species' last refuge on Earth. But even Tasmania would not remain a safe haven forever. In 1996, scientists first documented devil facial tumor disease, an extremely rare form of contagious cancer. Tasmanian devils often bite one another while fighting over food, mating, or competing, allowing cancer cells to pass directly through their wounds. As the tumors grow, they can deform the jaw, make eating increasingly difficult, and eventually leave the animal too weak to survive. Within just a few decades, the wild population declined by around 90%. And yet, this very species, now pushed toward extinction, would later achieve something remarkable, helping humans repair some of the damage they had done to nature. But to understand why that matters, you first need to know. When an important prey species disappears from the food web, a dangerous ecological gap can quickly emerge. And the animal that rapidly took advantage of that gap was the feral cat. Cats are not native to Australia. They were introduced by Europeans, later escaped into the wild, and eventually spread across nearly the entire continent. During the day, they hide beneath dense shrubs, between rocks, or inside fallen logs. But once darkness falls, the hunt begins. A lizard moving beneath dry leaves, a ground-nesting bird, or a small marsupial weighing only a few hundred grams can all become targets. Every year, feral cats are estimated to kill around 1 to 2 billion native animals. Australia has used traps, poison, hunting, and exclusion fencing to control them, but the problem remains extremely difficult to solve. Then, in Tasmania, scientists discovered an unexpected clue. They placed cameras in areas where Tasmanian devils were still abundant and compared them with locations where DFTD had caused devil populations to decline sharply. The results showed that in areas with fewer devils, feral cat activity was about 58% higher. So does that mean Tasmanian devils had actually solved Australia's feral cat problem? And if so, how did they do it? It was not as simple as hunting and eating cats. The answer was far more complicated, but we will come back to that later. Feral cats are not the only invasive predators causing serious problems for Australia. Beginning in the 19th century, Europeans introduced red foxes for recreational hunting. Within just a few decades, reddish foxes could be found across grasslands, shrublands, and along the edges of protected areas. After dark, a bandicoot emerging from its burrow, a bettong digging for food, or a small marsupial weighing only a few hundred grams might suddenly hear dry leaves rustling behind it. But many native species had never evolved alongside foxes, so their reactions were often too slow. They might freeze, run in the wrong direction, or simply fail to recognize the danger rushing toward them. Even more troubling, foxes do not always kill only for food. Through a behavior known as surplus killing, a single fox may kill multiple animals in succession, even when it cannot eat them all. As more and more evidence suggested that the disappearance of native predators had opened the door for cats and foxes to spread, scientists began considering the return of a native predator to the ecosystem. At first, the obvious choice seemed to be the dingo. Across many parts of Australia where dingoes are still present, they can put pressure on smaller predators, such as foxes and cats. So why not simply protect or restore dingo populations? The problem begins just beyond the farm fence. Dingoes are large enough to attack sheep and young livestock, which means any plan to expand their populations could immediately come into conflict with the livestock industry. An ecological solution could quickly turn into a struggle between conservationists and farmers trying to protect their animals. Scientists needed another predator, one strong enough to compete with cats and foxes, but smaller than a dingo and less likely to put pressure on livestock. The Tasmanian devil gradually emerged as a unique candidate. But before anyone could seriously consider returning them to the wild, Tim Faulkner and Aussie Ark first had to save the species itself from disappearing. Beginning in 2011, they started building an insurance population on mainland Australia, isolated from the DFTD outbreak in Tasmania. Over nearly a decade, more than 390 devils were born and raised, and by 2020, the program was caring for more than 200 animals. Behind large protective fences, staff tried to keep them as wild as possible, finding their own food, competing over carcasses, digging dens, and interacting with other devils. But Faulkner did not want them to spend their entire lives inside conservation enclosures. If Tasmanian devils really could compete with cats and foxes, the next step had to be returning them to a real ecosystem. The idea sounded promising, but not every scientist agreed. After a proposal to reintroduce devils to mainland Australia in 2015, one research team warned that the species could be little more than a blunt instrument. Data on interactions between predators were still limited. Devils were not simply smaller versions of dingoes, and introducing a predator into a new landscape could create consequences that computer models could not predict. Both sides had a point. One saw an opportunity to restore an ecosystem. The other saw the risk of creating an entirely new problem. So who was right? That may depend on how you see it. But in Australia, they ultimately decided to release them. But before any crate could be opened, Aussie Ark first had to build a place large enough for the Tasmanian devils to live on their own without depending on humans. In the Barrington Tops region of New South Wales, they enclosed 400 hectares of natural forest and surrounded the entire area with a predator-proof fence. Inside, it was still real wilderness, with trees, natural shelters, and wild food sources that forced the devils to forage for themselves, find dens, and establish territories. In November 2019, the fence was completed. Feral cats and foxes inside the sanctuary were then removed, turning the area into a transition zone between captive conservation and true life in the wild. But the 26 devils chosen for the project were not selected at random. They came from Aussie Ark's insurance population on mainland Australia that we mentioned earlier. Before the release, experts sat in front of pedigree charts, matching individual names and bloodlines to select a group that was healthy, genetically diverse, and carried as little risk of inbreeding as possible. More importantly, they had been raised in a way that preserved as many of their wild instincts as possible, competing for food, finding shelter, and interacting with other devils rather than living completely dependent on humans. First, 15 devils were released into the sanctuary as a trial. Signals from their radio collars showed that they began spreading out, exploring the terrain, and adapting to the forest. Only after that first group passed the test did the plan move to the next stage. On the 10th of September 2020, 11 more crates were brought into Barrington Tops. Chris Hemsworth, Elsa Pataky, and the conservation team stood nearby as each latch was opened. Lisa, Lenny, and the remaining devils stepped out, sniffed the dry leaves beneath their feet, and one by one disappeared among the eucalyptus trees. 26 Tasmanian devils had returned to mainland Australia after roughly 3,000 years. And the moment the last one disappeared from view, the role of humans changed as well. There would be no more meals placed in front of them or hands guiding them towards shelter. Instead, radio collars quietly transmitted signals from deep inside the forest, while camera traps waited for them to pass through the darkness. From that point on, the researchers could only stand outside and watch. The devils had to find their own food, choose their own dens, establish their own home ranges, and eventually find mates on their own. But if those 26 Tasmanian devils had survived and begun adapting, what happened during their very first year that truly stunned the conservation team? We are getting to that now. In May 2021, the Aussie ARC team carried out a routine health check on the female devils inside the sanctuary. Each animal was briefly recaptured so staff could examine its health and inspect the pouch on its belly. When a staff member gently opened the pouch of the first female, what they found inside was not an injury or a sign of weakness. It was a joey. Then they checked the second pouch, another one. By the end of the inspection, they had confirmed that at least 7 Tasmanian devil joeys had been born inside Barrington Wildlife Sanctuary, not inside a breeding facility, not beneath the warming lamps of a veterinary clinic, and not with humans standing nearby to assist the breeding process. The joeys had been born and were growing up in the bush of Barrington Tops. Their mothers had found their own shelter, found their own food, found mates, and become pregnant inside the very forest where their species had been absent from mainland Australia for roughly 3,000 years. That was what made the result so remarkable. Because before they could reproduce, those 26 devils first had to relearn almost every part of life in the wild. Which trails were safe, where food could be found, which dens could provide shelter during the day, and where the territories of other devils began and ended. Yet in their very first breeding season, a new population had already begun to form. Infrared cameras unexpectedly captured a mother devil moving slowly through the darkness. Some individuals traveled alone among the eucalyptus trees, while the home ranges of others began to overlap. 2 years later, camera traps captured another remarkable moment. 2 sisters that had been separated before the reintroduction appeared in the same area again. They were no longer animals being cared for by humans. They were choosing how to use the landscape, moving through it, and living like a wild population. Now, let's return to the most important question in this story. Why can Tasmanian devils reduce the numbers of cats and foxes without actually needing to eat them? The answer is simple: instinct. The Tasmanian devil is the largest surviving carnivorous marsupial, but it is not a predator that specializes in chasing down prey. Instead, it is an extremely efficient scavenger. A kangaroo carcass lying beside a road, an animal that died deep in the bush, even skin, organs, and bones, can all be consumed by a devil. And that creates very real competition with feral cats and foxes. Imagine a kangaroo has just died somewhere in an Australian forest. The smell quickly attracts a feral cat, but before the cat can drag away a piece of meat, a Tasmanian devil appears. It is larger, stronger, and begins making its characteristic growls and screeches before moving in to compete for the carcass. For a solitary cat, that confrontation may simply not be worth the risk. If food can be found somewhere else, why fight a Tasmanian devil for it? As a result, the regular presence of devils may cause cats to change when they forage or move into areas where there is less competition. But that is not all. Tasmanian devils can also create territorial pressure. They use many of the same feeding areas and may directly threaten or compete with smaller predators. With foxes, competition can also occur around carcasses and other food sources. Tasmanian devils are also capable of killing small prey, and in some cases may attack other predators. They do not need to turn cats or foxes into food to have an effect. Simply forcing them to avoid certain areas, change their movements, or lose access to part of their food supply can be enough to trigger a chain reaction. And that is what makes this reintroduction project so remarkable. Australia is not simply trying to save a native marsupial from extinction. If Tasmanian devils can establish a stable population, the project could accomplish 3 things at once: protect this native predator, restore a missing link in the ecosystem, and create additional natural pressure on invasive predators such as feral cats and foxes. And that is how one species could help address 3 of Australia's most serious ecological problems. The surrounding ecosystem also began to show signs of change. By 2022, bandicoots had been recorded returning to parts of Barrington Tops, while the eastern quoll, a species that had once become functionally extinct on mainland Australia, also began establishing a population after being reintroduced in 2021. Looking through the camera trap footage, researchers were no longer seeing just another Tasmanian devil moving through the bush. They were beginning to see multiple native species using the same landscape again. It was as if a forest that had been missing an important piece was slowly putting itself back together. But nature never follows a perfect script. In May 2025, an extreme weather event struck New South Wales, bringing major flooding, snow, and a so-called weather bomb. Trees were brought down, sections of the fencing were damaged, and parts of the habitat were flooded. This time, conservationists had to step in. Some Tasmanian devils were recaptured and moved to safer areas. Then, on the 21st of October 2025, Aussie ARC returned 14 devils to Barrington Wildlife Sanctuary, 12 males and 2 females after each animal had been weighed, given a health check, and treated for parasites. And this event highlighted an important lesson. Barrington is not yet a completely self-sustaining wilderness. Humans still have to inspect the fences, monitor the animals, and intervene when natural disasters occur. So while the 7 joeys born in 2021 were a major success, they were not yet the kind of success Australia ultimately hopes to achieve. They proved that Tasmanian devils could survive and reproduce after being absent from mainland Australia for more than 3,000 years. But they did not prove that feral cat numbers would decline, that fox numbers would fall, or that native wildlife would recover on a large scale. And they certainly did not prove that Tasmanian devils could expand their population beyond the protection of those fences on their own. But this is where the true scale of Aussie ARC's plan begins to emerge. Tasmanian devils are not the final goal. They are only the first species in a much larger plan to bring multiple native animals back to the same landscape. Within the 400-hectare Barrington Wildlife Sanctuary, Aussie ARC plans to reintroduce a total of 7 important species. Alongside Tasmanian devils, these include eastern quolls, brush-tailed rock wallabies, rufous bettongs, long-nosed potaroos, Parma wallabies, and southern brown bandicoots. A Tasmanian devil follows the scent of a carcass beneath the eucalyptus trees. Somewhere else, a bettong or potaroo lowers its head and digs through the leaf litter in search of fungi, roots, and other food. Every time these animals dig, they turn over the soil beneath them. Seeds, dead leaves, and organic matter are moved along with it. Small actions like these, repeated thousands of times, can influence how the soil retains water and nutrients, and even how vegetation regenerates. Along rocky slopes, brush-tailed rock wallabies search for shelter. In the undergrowth, bandicoots rummage through the leaf litter for insects. Eastern quolls continue hunting small prey. And above this network, Tasmanian devils both hunt and scavenge while also competing with other predators for food. The important point is that no single species can restore an entire forest on its own. Each species performs only one part of the job. Predators put pressure on other animals. Small mammals dig through the soil and forage in the leaf litter. Herbivores influence vegetation, and the plants respond to all of those changes. That is what Aussie ARC is really testing with rewilding at Barrington. Not simply releasing one species and waiting for everything else to change, but restoring each missing link one by one to see whether the relationships between them can form again. If it works, Barrington will become more than just a sanctuary for rare species. It will become an important experiment. Can humans help an ecosystem that has lost many of its key pieces begin functioning on its own again? The story of the Tasmanian devil shows that restoring nature is not always about eliminating a harmful species. Sometimes what matters more is bringing back a missing link so the ecosystem can begin finding its own balance again. But Barrington is still only the first experiment, and one major question remains: could Tasmanian devils one day live freely across mainland Australia again? Do you think this plan is worth expanding across Australia? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe if you enjoy stories about restoring nature like this one. And if you want to see an even more ambitious project, head to the next video.